The i7 brand was a major success for Team Blue. Not every model was a banger, admittedly, but somehow they managed to turn this series of CPUs into a widely recognised mark of quality for the better part of a decade. Even your everyday non-techie consumer knew that an Intel i7 was a good CPU, something worth paying the extra for, and that reputation began here. November 2008 saw Intel take their first step in rebranding their Core series CPUs, and this new format would come to define their whole catalogue for over a decade. Eventually the series would resolve into three tiers: the good, better, best combo of i3, i5 and i7, with the old reliable Pentium brand demoted to budget tier models only, after a few models Intel would rather forget, and Celeron still occupying the obligatory trash tier that Intel seemed to think they need to sell. Before all that, however, they started the Core i ball rolling with the i7 series. The i7-920, codenamed Bloomfield, was built on the same 45nm process as its predecessor, the Core 2 Quad 9000 series, but with several major improvements. The new architecture saw the introduction of Level 3 cache, in addition to the Level 1 and 2 that had been present on Core 2 quads. It also reintroduced hyperthreading, a technology that had come up with the Pentium 4, but which was absent from the Core and Core 2 series, meaning that the quad-core i7s now had 8 effective threads, a rare thing outside of dual CPU systems at the time. The memory controller was located on the CPU itself and supported native DDR3 in up to triple channel configurations. The front-side bus, a long-standing staple of CPUs from both brands, was replaced with the new Quick Path interface for connecting the CPU to the chipset. That chipset, called X58, would not make it to the mainstream consumer models, and neither would the CPU socket. X58 and the LGA1366 socket would come to be known as high-end desktop, and while in later times we'd come to expect at least 2 CPU generations per HEDT platform, the rule of 2 hadn't been implemented at that point. That didn't mean there was no progress for X58. 2010 saw the release of a number of 6-core CPUs for the platform, using a smaller 32nm process node and larger L3 cache, and this refresh would keep the X58 motherboards at the top of the stack until X79. This chip, however, is the first i7, or at least one of the 3 i7 models that were released on the same day, and which were separated only by clock and link speed. Like with so many other pioneering products, the first i7s weren't kind to early adopters. These original chips would be challenged by Intel's own 800 series i7s less than a year later, which were on the cheaper, more common H55 and P55 chipset motherboards, and they'd all be utterly eclipsed by Sandy Bridge in 2011. In fact, the speed with which the Intel CPUs left Bloomfield behind was staggering, and it's actually part of the reason why I've never featured this platform on Iceberg Tech before now. I normally like to look at older CPUs in a modern context, and that's harder to do with X58. The platform lacks AVX2 instruction support, has no TPM and therefore only limited Windows 11 compatibility, and there's really no reason to buy one in 2025 except out of pure nostalgia. Or, if like me, you want to make a video about it. I wanted to show the i7-920 in as good a light as I could, but overclocking this generation of CPU is a little less straightforward than I'm used to. I won't even bother trying to explain it, I only vaguely have a grasp of it myself, so I followed a guide online to get it up to 4 GHz, after apparently being a little too conservative with my voltages. I don't own enough matched sticks of DDR3 to make a nice neat triple channel kit, but the memory controller couldn't handle my RAM at its XMP settings anyway. Although I did at one point have the 1200 MHz DDR3 running at 930, the final CPU overclock ended up with the memory running at 843 MHz for an effective speed of 2529 MTs. I also had a hell of a time getting Windows installed. The BIOS doesn't recognise M.2 SSDs in a PCIe adapter. I had a SATA SSD with Windows 10 installed already, but it was formatted in GPT and the board didn't recognise it. And my Win 10 installer was on a 64GB USB stick, which the board didn't recognise. Oh, and my usual RX 7900 XT just gave out a black screen, so I'm using the second most powerful GPU I own, an RTX 4070. Crysis was already a year old when the first i7 launched. The ad for Core 2 Duos puts this game in its place in history, and being legendary for launching well before the PC hardware world was ready for it, it shouldn't be surprising that Crysis was too much for many of those CPUs at the time. At 1080p very high, the RTX 4070 doesn't have a lot to do, so its utilisation was particularly low, but even at 4GHz the i7 could barely scrape 60 FPS. Curiously though, despite being apparently CPU limited, dropping the quality preset to minimum and disabling anti-aliasing does actually improve performance, and makes it a far more playable experience. Of course, you didn't buy Crysis just to have it looking like ass, so I guess a near 60 FPS average will just have to do. Jumping ahead a few years, The Witcher 3 was one of the few games of this era in gaming that was actually fairly demanding on CPUs, especially in the city areas. Novigrad is packed with NPCs, and even at the Ultra preset the game's not being held back by the GPU. The average is 78 FPS with 1% lows just below 60, and the occasional loading stutter bringing the 0.1% score down to just 25. Turning hairworks off helps somewhat, but isn't quite enough to bring the lows over 60, and it can't do anything about the loading stutter, so if you're playing with a sufficiently powerful GPU, you might as well leave the fancy hair turned on, because you're worth it. It's a similar story in the other big PC release of 2015. GTA 5 sees performance fall apart at over 180 FPS, but there's no danger of that here. The i7-920 can pass 70 FPS on average, and loading stutters are much less of a problem here than in The Witcher, but we're still not seeing a rock-solid 60. Released almost 8 years after the first generation i7s, Civ 6 has two benchmark utilities, graphics and turn time. Of course, FPS is a nonsense metric for a decade-old strategy game being benchmarked with a modern RTX GPU, but I tested anyway and saw 73 on average. The turn time metric is a little more relevant, and one I also have more data for. At 4GHz, the i7-920 averages 8.35 seconds per turn. The Sandy Bridge i7-2600 is almost half a second faster while clocked 200 MHz lower, and an i3-12100F, clocked 100 MHz higher and paired with much faster memory, more cache, and a newer PCIe interface, is 2 seconds faster. 9 years after the i7-920 hit the market, Assassin's Creed Origins marked a real jump in CPU demands for the series. Its open-world Egyptian setting is heavy even on i7s of its day, so it's no real surprise that the first-generation model is starting to struggle here. This graphics card is far beyond anything that was on the market in 2017, and so it's not exactly being overworked here. The i7 is holding it back to under 60 FPS most of the time, and lows are a mere 30 FPS. For many people, Cyberpunk 2077 represents a watermark in modern games, an aspirational title for serial upgraders who wanted a game to get the very best out of their hardware. That counts for CPUs just as much as GPUs. The busier parts of Night City can be extremely heavy, and this proves to be too much for the OG i7. Without ray tracing, the 920 can only hit a 35 FPS average, and lows are in the teens. Adding Ultra RT, not path tracing, I'm not earning 5090 money just yet, brings that average down below 30, and I couldn't call either a particularly playable experience. Hitman: World of Assassination has a few variables to tweak that can actually make it reasonably performant on this old i7. There's a simulation setting that, despite specifically calling out graphics in the description, is particularly heavy on the CPU, and turning it down from best to base can almost triple the frame rate. With that setting maxed out, RT off averages under 40 FPS and RT on is barely over 20, and both benchmarks slow to a crawl once stuff starts exploding. Turning simulation down to base lifts the non-RT score to over 100 FPS, and RT on is a still playable 62. Again, both suffer major drops, resulting in a big difference between average and minimum frame rates, but it's nice to see a 2021 game playable on a 2008 CPU, even if that does mean making compromises. Alas, it's not all sunshine and handjobs. The i7 lacks the AVX2 instruction set, and that means some games simply won't start, especially Sony titles. I tested The Last of Us Part 1 and Spider-Man 2 to no avail, and from memory I believe the first Spider-Man has the same problem, as does Uncharted 4 and the Horizon games. A quick look on Google suggests there might be a patch for the God of War games, but honestly, I have no idea if they work. There are a few new games that do work on the Bloomfield CPUs. Sort of. Indiana Jones can kinda reach 90 FPS, but it crashed on me twice, either because it's not happy with the overclock, or because it just doesn't like the 920 in general. In Baldur's Gate 3, I initially had problems loading the game in Vulkan and had to use DX11 instead, which saw just below 40 FPS on average and some painfully low lows. I did go back and successfully test Vulkan later on, and while there was about a 5% improvement, if you're having problems getting Vulkan started, you're not really missing much. Something I found that plagued many of the games I tested on the 920 was loading times. Everything except Crysis and Witcher 3 took longer than I'd expect to load, and Space Marine 2 took so long I thought it had crashed. In-game, things are rough. The average of 31 FPS and lows under 21 mean this is pretty hard to play in combat. I thought I'd round off the video with a few eSports titles, starting with Apex Legends. This is a game I usually test on mini PCs, and honestly, I've had a better experience on some of them lately. The 105 FPS average and 67 1% lows are about on par with the results from the integrated graphics of a Ryzen 5 7640HS. That gives a little context as to how far we've come in the last couple of decades, but it's not to particularly denigrate the 920, it's still a playable experience. Counter-Strike 2 is less so, although the overlay looks good, occasionally spiking up to 90 and 100 FPS, measured over a whole match with so many frame drops occurring, the average is only 75, 1% lows are 41, and 0.1% lows are cinematic. I don't think this chip is a good choice for modern Counter-Strike. Recently I've been giving Fortnite a second chance, and I'm immediately regretting that decision. The first number is irrelevant, the 1% and 0.1% lows tell the story. This isn't even the first match, this is my second drop in roughly the same part of the map as the first, and it still plays like it was coded by idiots. If you need a little more independent context, I ran one synthetic benchmark and one pre-made Blender scene, and I have a lot of data to compare them to. With the i7-920 at 4GHz, Cinebench R23 manages a multi-core score of 3315 and a single-core score of 651. The single-core score is below that of some of the E-core chips I've tested in some very low-power mini-PCs, and unfortunately the i7 is using over 330 watts of power to achieve that score. The Blender Classroom test finished in 38 minutes, and while this isn't the slowest result I've ever seen, it's pretty far from the fastest, which is more like 2.5 minutes. So there we have it, the first and probably last time I'll ever feature a 1st Gen i7, at least perhaps until the 20th anniversary. As it stands, there's no reason to buy one of these in 2025, and if you have one in your current system, then you should definitely upgrade. If you live in a part of the world where electricity is expensive, switching to a more modern platform will pay for itself over a couple of years. Still, it's not completely fair to look at the i7-920 in a purely modern context. As the face that launched 1,000 chips, the start of a brand that would be the cornerstone of Intel's reputation back when they had one, the i7-920 deserves our respect. And now I'm going to respectfully put this X58 board in a drawer until I get round to picking up one of those 6-core Xeons. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.